What if I told you that somewhere in the world, there's a job posting that makes every other dangerous profession look like child's play? A job so terrifying, so utterly insane, that when the listing went public, not a single person applied. Not one. We're talking about a position that makes lion taming look like babysitting, that makes bomb disposal seem like a relaxing hobby. This is the story of the one woman who said yes when everyone else said absolutely not. And what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about monsters, courage, and the strangest kind of love story ever told. I'm about to take you into a world where the impossible becomes routine, where the line between predator and protector blurs beyond recognition, and where one desperate decision changed two lives forever. But before we dive into this incredible tale, let me paint you a picture of just how desperate things had gotten. Picture this. You listings at 3 a.m. You're scrolling through job bank account, showing a balance that wouldn't cover a decent meal, and your landlord's eviction notice is burning a hole in your pocket. You've applied to everything from dog walker to experimental drug tester, and still, nothing. Then you see it. The listing didn't have an address, just coordinates, buried deep in the mountains, where fog ate sound and the stars never looked the same twice. A posting that makes you do a double take, makes you wonder if you're hallucinating from hunger. The job description is vague, but terrifying. It mentions specialized creature care, extreme risk compensation, and a salary that's literally 10 times what you've ever made. The requirements: must be female, must be willing to relocate immediately, must sign a non-disclosure agreement, and must be prepared for unconventional working conditions. Oh, and here's the kicker: must be willing to work with what they call high-risk biological specimens. This is exactly what happened to Sarah, a 26-year-old veterinary technician whose life had spiraled into complete chaos. 3 months behind on rent, drowning in student loans, and fresh off losing her job at a prestigious animal hospital for questioning their treatment protocols. Sarah was the kind of person who'd rather sleep in her car than compromise her principles, which is exactly why she was sleeping in her car. But here's where the story gets interesting, because what Sarah didn't know when she clicked on that job listing was that she was about to become part of something that governments had been covering up for decades. She was about to enter a world where creatures from our darkest nightmares weren't just real. They were being studied, contained, and yes, milked for their extraordinary properties. Now, you might be wondering what kind of creature needs to be milked, and why no human wanted to do it. Well, imagine everything you've ever feared about monsters under the bed, about things that go bump in the night, about predators that hunt in the darkness. Then imagine that one of these creatures produces a substance so valuable, so incredibly powerful, that entire shadow organizations exist just to harvest it. The facility Sarah was about to enter wasn't on any official map. It wasn't listed in any government database. As far as the world knew, it simply didn't exist. But for those who knew where to look, who had the right clearance levels, who understood that some truths were too dangerous for public consumption, this place was the most important research station on the planet. The creature living in this facility had been there for over 50 years, captured during a military operation that was so classified that even the people who authorized it had their memories wiped afterward. This wasn't just any monster. This was something that had evolved beyond human understanding, something that existed in the space between nightmare and reality. For 5 decades, they'd tried everything to safely extract what they needed from this creature. They'd sent in teams of trained professionals, military specialists, scientists with decades of experience handling dangerous animals. Every single one of them had either quit within days or suffered what the files diplomatically referred to as psychological trauma, requiring intensive therapy. The creature wasn't just dangerous in the traditional sense. It wasn't like dealing with a wild tiger or a venomous snake. Those are predictable threats that follow natural patterns. This thing was intelligent, calculating, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in psychologically destroying anyone who came near it. It could sense fear, could smell weakness, could exploit every insecurity and trauma its handlers had ever experienced. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. It had never hurt a single person physically, not once, despite having the clear capability to tear apart steel reinforcement, despite possessing strength that defied every law of physics they understood. It had never laid a claw on any of its handlers. Instead, it would get inside their heads, would whisper things that made grown men weep, would show them visions that haunted their dreams for years afterward. The psychological warfare was so effective that the facility had gone through over 200 handlers in 50 years. The turnover rate was so extreme that they'd stopped keeping detailed records because it was too depressing. Insurance companies had actually blacklisted the facility because the mental health claims were bankrupting their coverage plans. By the time Sarah's application crossed the desk of Dr. Marcus Webb, the facility director, they were getting desperate, really desperate. The creature produced its valuable secretions on a monthly cycle, and they'd already missed 3 harvests because they couldn't keep anyone on staff long enough to complete the process. Each missed harvest represented millions of dollars in lost research opportunities, not to mention the pharmaceutical breakthroughs that were being delayed. Dr. Webb had been running this facility for 15 years, and he'd never seen anything like it. He'd watched decorated war veterans break down after a single shift. He'd seen scientists with nerves of steel quit via text message, rather than face another day in that containment unit. The creature seemed to have an uncanny ability to find exactly the right psychological pressure point to apply. Like it could read people's deepest fears and most painful memories. But something about Sarah's application was different. Maybe it was the fact that she'd applied at all when hundreds of others had seen the posting and immediately closed their browsers. Maybe it was her background in veterinary medicine, which suggested she understood animal behavior in ways that pure researchers didn't. Or maybe it was the desperate edge in her cover letter that suggested she literally had nothing left to lose. When Dr. Webb called Sarah for her interview, he didn't sugarcoat anything. He told her about the previous handlers, about the psychological evaluations, about the fact that most people couldn't last more than a week. He explained that the job involved entering a secure containment unit twice daily to perform what he euphemistically called biological collection procedures on a creature that most people couldn't even look at without experiencing severe panic attacks. Sarah's response was simple. When do I start? What Dr. Webb didn't tell Sarah during that phone call was that the creature had been exhibiting unusual behavior patterns lately. After 50 years of consistent hostility toward its handlers, it had suddenly become quiet, almost contemplative. The facility's monitoring systems had detected changes in its biorhythms, alterations in its vocal patterns, and most mysteriously, it had stopped its psychological attacks on the cleaning staff. Some of the researchers theorized that the creature was evolving, adapting to its captivity in ways they hadn't anticipated. Others worried that it was planning something, that the sudden change in behavior was a precursor to an escape attempt. But Dr. Webb had a different theory, one he kept to himself because it sounded too impossible to voice out loud. He suspected the creature was waiting for something, or someone. The facility itself was a marvel of engineering and security. But there was something wrong about the place, an ancient wrongness that humming generators couldn't hide. It felt less like a lab and more like a cathedral built to worship fear itself. Built into the side of a mountain in a location that required 3 different security clearances just to find on a map, it was designed to contain things the conventional prisons couldn't handle. The main containment unit was a sphere suspended in the center of a massive cavern, accessible only by a single retractable bridge that could be withdrawn at a moment's notice. Inside that sphere lived the creature that had stumped scientists for half a century. The iron shell wasn't just containment. It was a sanctum, pulsing with old promises. Symbols older than language were etched into the metal, their meanings long forgotten, but still hungry. They'd never been able to properly classify it because it seemed to exist outside normal biological parameters. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but larger, with features that seemed to shift depending on the lighting and the observer's angle of view. Some handlers described it as having scales, others insisted it had fur, and a few swore they'd seen smooth skin that reflected light like polished stone. The one thing every handler agreed on was the eyes, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through you, that appeared to catalog every weakness, every fear, every secret shame you'd ever carried. Eyes that suggested a mind far more complex and calculating than anyone wanted to acknowledge. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Sarah was about to discover that everything the facility thought they knew about this creature was wrong. The psychological torture, the calculated cruelty, the systematic destruction of handler after handler. It wasn't random sadism or territorial aggression. It was a test. For 50 years, this creature had been waiting for someone who could pass a trial that no one even realized they were taking. Someone who could see past the monster to something else entirely. Someone whose desperation was genuine enough, whose need was real enough, whose heart was open enough to recognize what everyone else had missed. The creature wasn't just producing a valuable biological substance. It was producing something that could only be given willingly, something that required trust and connection, and a bond that transcended species barriers. And after 5 decades of waiting, it was about to meet the one person who might understand that. But first, Sarah had to survive her first day on the job. And based on the facility's track record, that was far from guaranteed. As Sarah packed her few remaining possessions into her battered car and prepared to drive toward a destination that didn't officially exist, she had no idea that she was about to become part of the most extraordinary interspecies relationship in recorded history. She thought she was just taking a job that would pay her bills and give her a roof over her head. She had no idea she was about to fall in love with a monster. The drive to the facility took Sarah through increasingly remote terrain, past checkpoints that didn't appear on any GPS system, through valleys that seemed to exist in a perpetual twilight even at midday. Each mile marker brought her deeper into a world that operated by different rules, where the normal laws of bureaucracy and public accountability simply didn't apply. Her escort, a stone-faced security officer who'd introduced himself only as Agent Martinez, hadn't spoken a word since picking her up at the last civilian gas station 50 miles back. The silence was unnerving, but not nearly as unnerving as the landscape they were passing through. Dead trees stretched toward an overcast sky like skeletal fingers, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes from the surrounding forest. When the facility finally came into view, Sarah's first thought was that it looked like a cross between a maximum security prison and a space station. Massive concrete walls rose from the mountainside, bristling with surveillance equipment and defensive systems that seemed designed to keep things in rather than keep people out. The entrance was a tunnel that burrowed directly into solid rock, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow their headlights whole. Dr. Webb was waiting for her in what he called the orientation room, though it felt more like an interrogation chamber. Stark white walls, fluorescent lighting that hummed with an almost subliminal frequency, and a metal table with 2 chairs that had clearly seen better days. He was younger than Sarah had expected from his voice on the phone, maybe early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of deep-set exhaustion that comes from years of managing the impossible. Before we proceed any further, Dr. Webb began, sliding a tablet across the table toward her. You need to understand exactly Eing 2. This isn't just a what you agree non-disclosure agreement. This is a complete separation from your previous life. As far as the outside world is concerned, Sarah died in a car accident 3 days ago. Sarah stared at the document on the screen, watching as page after page of legal terminology scrolled past. Terms like permanent assignment, memory modification protocols, and posthumous identity maintenance jumped out at her, each one more unsettling than the last. But what really caught her attention was the compensation package. The numbers were so large they didn't seem real, with benefits that extended to family members she'd never mentioned and insurance policies that would take care of people she'd lost touch with years ago. You've been researching me, she said, looking up from the tablet. Dr. Webb nodded. We research everyone, Sarah. But in your case, we found something interesting. Every psychological profile we ran, every predictive model we tested, came back with the same result. You're not supposed to be afraid of what's down there. What do you mean? I mean that according to every test we can devise, you should be the ideal handler for our specimen. Your psychological makeup, your response patterns, your emotional stability markers. They all suggest you'll succeed where everyone else has failed. The problem is, we don't understand why. Sarah signed the document without reading the rest of it. What choice did she have? Behind her lay a life of debt, failure, and sleeping in her car. Ahead lay the unknown. But at least it was an unknown that came with a paycheck and a purpose. The orientation process took 3 days. 3 days of medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and briefings that revealed just how little the facility actually knew about their primary resident. They could tell her the creature's feeding schedule, its sleep patterns, its waste elimination cycles. But when it came to understanding what it actually was, they were operating on 50 years of educated guesswork. We call it Subject 47, Dr. Webb explained, as they walked through corridors lined with monitoring equipment, though some of the older staff refer to it as the collector. It's been here since 1973, captured during a military operation in Cambodia that was so classified that most of the participants had their memories altered afterward. The few records that survive suggest it was found in a temple complex that had been abandoned for centuries, apparently guarding something that the recovery team never found. They paused at a massive steel door marked with biohazard symbols and warning signs in a dozen languages. Through a reinforced window, Sarah could see into an observation room filled with monitors and recording equipment. Beyond that, through another window, lay the containment sphere itself, a perfect metal orb suspended in the center of a cavern that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of the facility's lighting system. The sphere is 30 feet in diameter, Dr. Webb continued, with walls designed to contain anything up to a small nuclear explosion. The interior is climate-controlled, furnished according to specifications we've developed through trial and error over the decades. The creature seems to prefer darkness, so the lighting can be adjusted from complete blackness to daylight intensity. Temperature is maintained at exactly 72 degrees, humidity at 40%. Sarah pressed her face to the observation window, trying to see into the containment sphere. The interior was dimly lit, revealing what looked like a living space that had been designed by someone with no understanding of human comfort. Strange furniture made from materials she didn't recognize, walls covered in what might have been artwork or might have been territorial markings, and in the center of it all, a shape that her eyes couldn't quite focus on. "Is it sleeping?" she asked. "We're never entirely sure. It doesn't seem to follow normal sleep cycles, and our monitoring equipment can't get clear readings on its biological functions. Sometimes it's motionless for days at a time. Other times, it paces the perimeter of the sphere for hours. The only consistent pattern we've observed is its reaction to new handlers, which is," Dr. Webb's expression darkened, "it tests them, usually within the first few minutes of contact. It seems to know exactly what psychological pressure points will cause the most damage, and it applies that pressure with surgical precision. We've had handlers quit mid-sentence during their first introduction. Others have lasted longer, sometimes days or even weeks, but they all break eventually." Sarah studied the shape in the containment sphere, trying to make out details through the reinforced glass and dim lighting. There was something about its posture, the way it seemed to be listening even in apparent rest, that suggested a level of awareness that went beyond mere animal intelligence. "What does it want?" she asked. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we knew what it wanted, maybe we could find a way to coexist with it instead of just surviving its presence. But after 50 years of study, we're no closer to understanding its motivations than we were when it first arrived." The tour continued through laboratories filled with equipment Sarah didn't recognize, past storage rooms containing substances that seemed to glow with their own inner light, through briefing rooms where walls were covered with charts and graphs documenting decades of failed attempts to establish meaningful communication with Subject 47. But it was the handler records that really drove home the magnitude of what Sarah was agreeing to. File after file of psychological evaluations, incident reports, and exit interviews painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare that had claimed the sanity of some of the most qualified animal handlers in the world. Military veterans with experience in psychological operations, zoologists who'd worked with the most dangerous predators on Earth, researchers who dedicated their careers to studying aggressive behavior. All of them had been reduced to quivering wrecks by whatever lived in that metal sphere. The longest anyone has lasted was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Dr. Webb explained, pulling up her file on one of the briefing room monitors. She managed 3 months before she suffered what the medical team described as a complete psychological break. She kept insisting that the creature was trying to communicate with her, that it was showing her visions of places that couldn't possibly exist. The final incident report states that she was found trying to open the containment sphere's access hatch while screaming that she had to go home to a place she'd never been. Sarah studied Dr. Morrison's photograph. A competent-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a confident smile. The contrast with her final psychological evaluation, which described her as catatonic and unresponsive to external stimuli, was deeply unsettling. What happened to her? She's in a private care facility upstate, the best money can buy, and she'll never lack for anything she needs. But she hasn't spoken a coherent word in 15 years. Sometimes she draws pictures, always the same thing, a vast city made of black stone, with towers that reach into a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. The final phase of Sarah's orientation was the equipment briefing. She was fitted with a protective suit that looked like something designed for deep-sea exploration, complete with its own air supply and communication system. The suit was equipped with sensors that would monitor her vital signs, stress levels, and brain activity in real time, transmitting all data to the observation room, where a team of specialists would be watching her every move. The collection procedure itself is relatively simple, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the facility's head veterinarian. The creature produces a secretion through specialized glands located along its spine. The secretion has unique properties that we still don't fully understand, but it's proven invaluable in developing treatments for everything from degenerative nerve diseases to certain types of cancer. The collection process involves using a specialized syringe to extract the substance directly from the source. Sarah examined the collection equipment, a device that looked like a cross between a medical syringe and some kind of high-tech vacuum system. The needle was longer than her hand and made from a metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. How close do I need to get? Physical contact is required. The creature will need to remain still during the procedure, which typically takes about 10 minutes. Previous handlers have reported that this is usually when the psychological attacks are most intense. Has anyone ever tried just talking to it? Dr. Martinez and Dr. Webb exchanged glances, the kind of look that suggested Sarah had just asked something they'd hoped she wouldn't think of. Many have tried, Dr. Webb said carefully. The results have been counterproductive. The creature seems to use any attempt at communication as an opportunity to gather information about the handler's psychological vulnerabilities. The more someone tries to connect with it, the more ammunition they provide for their own destruction. But something in their tone suggested there was more to the story, something they weren't telling her. Sarah made a mental note to dig deeper into the handler records when she had access to the full database. Her final night before starting work, Sarah lay in her assigned quarters, a small but comfortable room that felt like a cross between a hotel suite and a prison cell, staring at the ceiling and wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The walls were thick enough to block out most sound, but she could still hear the hum of machinery, the whisper of air circulation systems, and underneath it all, something else. A sound so low it was more felt than heard, like the breathing of some massive creature just beyond the edge of perception. Tomorrow, she would enter that containment sphere and come face to face with something that had broken the minds of 200 trained professionals. Tomorrow, she would discover whether she was truly different from all the others, or whether she was just the latest in a long line of people who'd overestimated their own psychological resilience. But tonight, as she drifted off to sleep in a bed that was more comfortable than any she'd slept in for months, Sarah had no idea that her life was about to change in ways that would challenge everything she thought she knew about monsters, about love, and about the thin line that separates the two. What Sarah discovered on her first morning at the facility was that all the psychological preparation in the world couldn't have readied her for the actual moment when the containment sphere's airlock cycled open and she found herself standing face to face with the impossible. The creature was nothing like she'd expected, and yet somehow exactly what she'd been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a physique that seemed to shift between human and something far more primal, depending on how the light caught its form. Its skin had the deep gray-black color of storm clouds, marked with intricate patterns that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. But it was the intelligence in its dark eyes that stopped her cold, an awareness so profound and ancient that it made her feel like a child stumbling into a conversation between gods. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. They simply stared at each other across the curved interior of the containment sphere. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify potential threats, maintain calm body language. But underneath the professional veneer, something else was happening. Something her 3 days of orientation hadn't prepared her for. She wasn't afraid. Fear bent around him, like light around gravity. His presence was wrong and right all at once, terrifying. And yet her pulse found its rhythm inside that wrongness. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Every other handler had described overwhelming terror, crushing dread, the primal urge to flee that made rational thought impossible. But standing there, in her protective suit, with the creature's gaze fixed on her like a searchlight, Sarah felt something else entirely. Curiosity, wonder, and underneath it all, a strange sense of recognition, as if she were looking at someone she'd been expecting to meet her entire life. The creature tilted its head, and Sarah could swear she saw surprise flicker across its features. It took a step closer, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and Sarah found herself stepping forward to meet it halfway. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely audible through the suit's communication system. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to some deeper part of her consciousness. Images flooded her mind. Vast landscapes under alien skies, cities built from materials that didn't exist on Earth. Creatures of impossible beauty, dancing through air, thick with colors that had no names. It wasn't language. It was memory, folded into starlight. Somewhere inside those visions, she recognized a call that had always been waiting for her, and threading through it all, a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache with sympathetic pain. In the observation room, alarms were going off. Sarah's biometric readings were spiking in ways the monitoring team had never seen before. Not the sharp spikes of terror they were used to tracking, but something else entirely. Her brain activity was off the charts, but her stress levels were actually decreasing. Her heart rate was elevated but steady, like someone in the middle of an intense but pleasant conversation. Dr. Webb was shouting orders into his headset, demanding explanations that no one could provide. "She's been in there for over an hour and she hasn't moved from her initial position. The creature is within arm's reach and she's showing no signs of distress. This doesn't match any profile we've ever recorded." But Sarah couldn't hear the chaos in the observation room. She was lost in something that felt like the most important conversation of her life, even though no words were being spoken. The creature was showing her things, memories perhaps, or visions of places that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. She saw herself through its eyes, not as a handler or a threat or a source of torment, but as something precious and long-awaited, something worth the 50-year wait. When she finally moved, it was to slowly reach up and activate her suit's helmet release. The action triggered a cascade of alarms in the observation room, but Sarah ignored them. She needed to breathe the same air as this magnificent being, needed to experience this moment without the barrier of processed atmosphere and recycled oxygen. The air inside the containment sphere was warm and carried scents that reminded her of rainforests and ocean storms and something indefinably wild that made her soul sing. The creature watched her remove her helmet with what she could only describe as reverence, as if she were performing some sacred ritual that it had been hoping to witness for decades. "You're beautiful," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The creature's response was a sound, like wind chimes made of starlight, a vocalization that seemed to resonate in her bones and make her skin tingle with pleasant electricity. It extended one massive hand toward her, moving so slowly and carefully that she understood this was an invitation, not a demand, an offer that she could accept or decline without consequence. Sarah reached out and placed her much smaller hand in its palm, and the world exploded into sensation, not pain. She realized immediately that all the stories about psychological torture had been misunderstandings. What the creature shared with its handlers wasn't cruelty, it was connection, raw, unfiltered emotional truth that most human minds simply couldn't process. It was showing them everything it was, everything it had experienced, everything it hoped for and feared and dreamed about during the long decades of captivity. Previous handlers had interpreted this overwhelming intimacy as an attack because they couldn't conceive of a bond so complete, so honest, so free of the walls and defenses that humans built around their hearts. They had fought against the connection, tried to maintain their psychological barriers, and the creature's desperate attempts to reach them had torn those barriers apart from the inside out. But Sarah didn't fight it. She opened herself completely to the alien consciousness touching hers. Let it flow through her thoughts and memories and emotions like water through cupped hands. She showed it her own loneliness, her own desperate search for purpose and belonging, her own dreams of finding someone who could see past her defenses to the person she really was underneath. The creature's joy was like being struck by lightning made of pure happiness. For 50 years, it had been reaching out to handler after handler, trying to find someone who could understand that its offerings weren't weapons, but gifts, someone who could accept the profound intimacy of true connection without being destroyed by it. In the observation room, Dr. Webb was watching Sarah's biometric readings with growing amazement and concern. Her brain activity was showing patterns they'd never recorded before. Not the chaotic spikes of psychological breakdown, but something that looked almost like harmony, as if two separate consciousness were learning to resonate in perfect synchronization. "Sir," one of the technicians called out, "you need to see this. The creature's bio readings are matching hers. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if they're becoming synchronized on a neurological level." Dr. Webb stared at the monitors, trying to process what he was seeing. In 50 years of study, they'd never been able to get clear biological readings from the creature. Its physiology seemed to exist partially time, making outside normal space conventional monitoring impossible. But now, somehow, Sarah's presence was stabilizing its energy patterns enough for their instruments to actually track its responses. And what they were tracking was unprecedented. The creature's stress hormones, which had remained at chronically elevated levels for decades, were dropping to normal ranges for the first time since its arrival. Its brain activity was showing patterns that could only be described as contentment, even happiness. And most remarkably of all, the specialized glands along its spine were activating in ways they'd never observed before. The secretion production is increasing exponentially, Dr. Martinez reported, her voice tight with excitement and concern. We're seeing output levels that are 10 times higher than anything we've recorded. But the composition is different too. The molecular structure is more complex, more stable. It's as if the creature's body is producing an entirely different substance than what we've been collecting. Back in the containment sphere, Sarah was learning that everything the facility thought they knew about the collection process was wrong. The creature wasn't producing a simple biological secretion that could be harvested like venom from a snake. What it created was something far more extraordinary, a physical manifestation of emotional and psychic energy that could willingly, as it only be given an expression of trust and connection. The substance that formed along its spine, when it was truly content, truly connected to another consciousness, wasn't just valuable for its medical properties. It was a bridge between worlds, a key that could unlock potentials in human consciousness that most people never dreamed existed. But it only worked when it was freely given, when the creature chose to share its gifts with someone it trusted completely. Previous handlers had been trying to steal something that could only be received as a gift. No wonder they'd all failed so spectacularly. Sarah understood this instinctively as she stood there with her hand in the creature's grasp, feeling its ancient loneliness transform into something bright and warm and infinitely precious. This wasn't a job. It was a partnership, a relationship that would require trust and patience and a willingness to see beyond the surface to the magnificent consciousness that lived beneath the frightening exterior. "I see you," she whispered, and the creature's response was a wave of gratitude, so pure it brought tears to her eyes. "I see who you really are." Hours passed, like minutes. Sarah found herself sitting cross-legged on the strange furniture, listening to the creature's wordless stories about worlds beyond imagination, sharing her own memories of a childhood spent feeling like an outsider in a species that never quite made sense to her. They communicated in images and emotions, and something deeper than language, building a bridge of understanding that spanned the gap between two entirely different forms of consciousness. When the facility's emergency protocols finally forced Dr. Webb to interrupt their communion, Sarah felt the separation like a physical wound. The creature's distress was immediately apparent. Not the rage or hostility that previous interruptions had triggered, but a profound sadness that made the air itself seem to weep. "I have to go," Sarah said, pressing her palm against the creature's chest, where she could feel something that might have been a heartbeat. "But I'll come back. I promise. I'll come back." The creature's response was complex. Understanding mixed with fear, hope tempered by decades of abandonment, trust offered despite every reason for caution. It pressed something into her hand, a small object that felt warm and seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Sarah looked down to see what appeared to be a scale, or perhaps a feather, though it was unlike anything she'd ever seen before. It shifted colors as she watched, cycling through shades that had no names, and when she touched it to her lips, she could taste starlight and ocean spray and the promise of tomorrow. "Until next time," she whispered, and tucked the impossible gift into her suit's inner pocket, right next to her heart. The decontamination process felt like torture after the profound connection she'd just experienced. The chemical showers, the medical scans, the endless questions from researchers who couldn't begin to understand what had happened in that containment sphere. All of it felt like being forced back into a box that no longer fit her changed consciousness. But the real shock came when Dr. Webb showed her the collection results. The vials filled with the creature's secretion glowed with their own inner light, and when Sarah held one up to examine it, she could swear she heard music, not with her ears, but with some deeper sense that the creature's touch had awakened in her. In 4 hours, you collected more high-quality material than we've harvested in the past 5 years, combined, Dr. Webb said, his voice tight with amazement, and something that might have been fear. The molecular composition is unlike anything we've seen before. Our preliminary analysis suggests it has properties that could revolutionize everything, from neurological medicine to quantum computing. Sarah nodded absently, but her attention was focused on the warm pulse against her chest, where the creature's gift rested against her heart. She could feel it responding to her emotions, could sense through it the creature's own state of mind. Right now, it was waiting, not with the desperate hope of previous separations, but with the patient confidence of someone who had finally found what they'd been searching for. She didn't know how she knew it, only that their meeting hadn't been random. Every failed handler, every sleepless night, every desperate choice, it had all led here, as if destiny had coordinates. "When do I go back?" she asked. Dr. Webb hesitated. "Sarah, what happened in there? It's unprecedented. We need to run more tests, analyze the data, understand exactly what kind of connection was established. The psychological implications alone. When do I go back?" she repeated, and something in her voice made him step back involuntarily, because Sarah was no longer the desperate, broke veterinary technician who had signed their contracts 3 days ago. The creature's gift had awakened something in her, unlocked potentials that had been dormant her entire life. She could feel the change in herself, not just emotionally, but physically. Her senses were sharper, her reflexes faster, her mind clearer and more focused than it had ever been. More importantly, she could feel the creature's loneliness, like a constant ache in her chest, could sense its need for connection and companionship and understanding. After 50 years of isolation, it had finally found someone who could truly it, truly accept it, truly love it for what it was, rather than fear it for what it appeared to be. And Sarah was beginning to realize that what she felt in return wasn't just professional fascination or even sympathy. It was something deeper, more profound, more transformative than anything she'd ever experienced with another human being. She was falling in love with a monster, and the monster was falling in love with her right back. The question was, what were they going to do about it? The facility's entire operational framework began crumbling within hours of Sarah's first successful collection. For 50 years, they'd operated under the assumption that Subject 47 was essentially a dangerous biological resource to be managed and harvested. Now, faced with evidence that it was actually an intelligent being capable of forming emotional bonds, everything they thought they knew was being called into question. Dr. Webb found himself in the impossible position of having to report unprecedented success, while simultaneously admitting that their fundamental understanding of the situation had been completely wrong. The collection yields were beyond anything they'd projected in their most optimistic scenarios, but the methodology required to achieve those yields challenged every protocol they'd established. Meanwhile, Sarah was experiencing changes that went far beyond the normal psychological adjustments of a new job. The creature's gift, that strange scale or feather that pulsed against her chest, seemed to be acting as some kind of biological catalyst. Her vision was sharper, colors more vivid, and she could hear sounds at frequencies that should have been beyond human perception. More unsettling was her growing ability to sense the emotional around her. States of people as if the creature's empathic abilities were somehow bleeding through their connection. The medical team ran every test they could devise, but Sarah's physiology remained stubbornly normal, according to their instruments. Whatever changes were occurring were happening at levels their equipment couldn't detect. Dr. Martinez theorized that the creature's secretions might have properties that affected human biology in ways they'd never suspected. But without more data, it was impossible to know whether Sarah was undergoing enhancement or contamination. What they did know was that her success rate was unprecedented and completely unrepeatable with anyone else. 3 other handlers had volunteered to attempt the new methodology, hoping to replicate Sarah's results. All 3 had lasted less than 10 minutes in the containment sphere before requesting immediate extraction. The creature's response to their presence had been polite but distant, like a host entertaining unwelcome guests. No psychological warfare, no mind games, but also no connection, no trust, and no secretion production. It was becoming clear that whatever had happened between Sarah and Subject 47 was unique, irreplaceable, and absolutely essential to the facility's continued operation, which put Dr. Webb in the uncomfortable position of having to keep Sarah happy while simultaneously studying her like a lab specimen. The daily routine that developed over the following weeks would have seemed impossible to anyone who'd known the facility's previous operations. Sarah would enter the containment sphere each morning and evening, spending hours in communion with the creature that had terrorized 200 previous handlers. Their interactions followed no protocol that the observation team could identify, resembling nothing so much as intimate conversations between old friends. Sometimes, Sarah would bring books and read aloud, her voice carrying stories of human culture and history to a being that had been isolated from such things for decades. The creature would respond with its own wordless narratives, sharing visions of distant worlds and impossible landscapes that left Sarah's eyes bright with wonder. Other times, they would simply sit together in comfortable silence, 2 consciousness existing in perfect harmony, despite the vast differences in their origins and nature. The collection process itself became almost incidental to these meetings. The creature would position itself to allow easy access to its spinal glands, remaining perfectly still while Sarah performed the extraction procedure. But it was clear to everyone watching that this cooperation wasn't the result of training or conditioning. It was the willing participation of a being that trusted Sarah completely and wanted to help her succeed in her work. The quality and quantity of the secretions collected during these sessions defied every projection the research team had made. The substance itself seemed to respond to the emotional connection between Sarah and the creature, becoming more potent and complex when their bond was strongest. Analysis revealed molecular structures that shouldn't have been stable under normal conditions, compounds that exhibited properties bordering on the supernatural. But the most significant change wasn't in the creature's biology. It was in Sarah's. Each session seemed to strengthen whatever connection had been established between them. She began experiencing what she could only describe as shared dreams, finding herself walking through alien landscapes while she slept, exploring vast cities built from materials that didn't exist on Earth. These weren't nightmares or psychological intrusions, but invitations to see the universe through the creature's ancient eyes. Dr. Webb watched these developments with growing concern and fascination. Sarah's psychological evaluations showed none of the deterioration that had characterized previous handlers. Instead, she seemed to be thriving, becoming more confident and centered with each passing day. Her performance reviews were flawless, her collection rates unprecedented, and her relationship with the creature appeared to be growing stronger rather than burning out. But there were troubling signs as well. Sarah was spending increasingly long periods in the containment sphere, often having to be reminded that her scheduled collection time had ended hours ago. She spoke less frequently with her human colleagues, seeming to prefer the wordless communication she shared with Subject 47. Most concerning of all, she had begun making requests that suggested a fundamental shift in her priorities and loyalties. "I want to know more about how he was captured," Sarah said, during one of her weekly briefings with Dr. Webb. The casual use of a gendered pronoun wasn't lost on anyone in the room. She was the first handler to refer to Subject 47 as anything other than it or the creature. The operational details of the recovery mission are classified beyond your clearance level. Dr. Webb replied carefully, "What I can tell you is that the extraction was necessary for both scientific advancement and global security." Sarah's expression hardened in a way that reminded Dr. Webb uncomfortably of the creature's own capacity for controlled menace. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was protecting something, and your people took him away from it. He's been grieving for 50 years, and nobody bothered to find out why. Subject 47 is not capable of human emotions like grief, Sarah. What you're interpreting as sadness is likely just a stress response to captivity. His name is Kalen. The name tasted ancient, like thunder caught between prayers. The moment she spoke it aloud, something unseen in the room exhaled. Dust, air, or fate itself. The words fell into the briefing room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward from Sarah's calm announcement. That's what he calls himself in the deep language that doesn't translate into human sounds. It means guardian of the threshold in concepts that we don't have words for. Dr. Webb leaned forward, his expression a mixture of fascination and alarm. "Sarah, you need to understand that anthropomorphizing the subject is a dangerous psychological trap. It's a defense mechanism that previous handlers have used to cope with the stress of the assignment, and it's never ended well." "I'm not anthropomorphizing anything," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a certainty that brooked no argument. "I'm finally seeing him clearly for the first time in 50 years. He's not a specimen or a resource or a threat to be managed. He's a person, just not a human person, and he's been trying to tell you that since the day he arrived here." The implications of Sarah's claims sent shockwaves through the facility's research protocols. If Subject 47 was truly a sapient being, rather than an advanced animal, then everything they'd been doing constituted imprisonment rather than containment. The legal and ethical ramifications alone would be enough to shut down the entire program. Never mind the scientific revolution that would result from confirmed contact with non-human intelligence. But more immediately pressing was the question of Sarah's own state of mind. Her connection with the creature had clearly progressed beyond anything they'd anticipated, and her growing advocacy for its personhood suggested a level of psychological investment that could compromise the entire operation. Dr. Webb found himself walking a tightrope between maintaining operational security and keeping his only successful handler happy and productive. The situation became even more complicated when Sarah began making requests that went far beyond the scope of her original job description. She wanted to know about the creature's dietary preferences, its sleep cycles, its apparent interest in music and literature. She pushed for environmental modifications to the containment sphere, arguing that 50 years of sensory deprivation were causing unnecessary psychological damage to a being whose intelligence might rival their own. Most troubling of all, she had begun asking questions about the facility's long-term plans for Subject 47. Questions about whether they'd ever considered the possibility of communication, of negotiation, of treating it as something other than a resource to be exploited. Questions that suggested she was beginning to see the world from the creature's perspective, rather than the facility's. Dr. Webb's attempts to maintain professional distance became increasingly difficult as Sarah's performance continued to exceed every metric they could devise. The quality of the secretions she collected was so superior to previous samples that their pharmaceutical partners were offering unprecedented sums for exclusive access. The research possibilities alone were worth hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially revolutionizing fields from neurology to quantum physics. But Sarah seemed increasingly uninterested in the commercial applications of her work. Her focus was entirely on the creature itself, on understanding its needs, its history, its perspective on the decades of captivity it had endured. She spoke about it with the kind of protective devotion that suggested her feelings had evolved far beyond professional interest or even sympathy. The breaking point came during Sarah's 6th week at the facility, when she submitted a formal request that left Dr. Webb staring at his computer screen in disbelief. She wanted to spend the night in the containment sphere, not for research purposes or extended collection procedures, but simply to keep the creature company during what she described as its vulnerable sleep cycles. "Absolutely not," Dr. Webb said when Sarah appeared in his office to discuss the request. "The risk assessment alone would be off the charts. We have no idea what might happen if you're in the sphere during extended periods without monitoring." "You monitor me constantly anyway," Sarah replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the comfortable confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards. "And Kalen would never hurt me. He spent 50 years being careful not to hurt any of the handlers, even the ones who were actively trying to harm him. You don't know that. You can't know that. You're making assumptions based on limited interaction time and anthropomorphic projection." Sarah's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made Dr. Webb's skin crawl. "I know because I've seen his memories. I know because when our minds touch, I can feel his absolute horror at the thought of causing pain to any living being. I know because he's shown me what happened to the handlers who broke down, not because he attacked them, but because he couldn't bear to feel their fear and hatred and loneliness without being able to help them." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with an intensity that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "He's not the monster in this story, Dr. Webb. We are. We've kept a sentient being in solitary confinement for 5 decades, treating him like a laboratory animal while he tried desperately to communicate with us. The psychological torture that everyone talks about, that was him trying to share his experiences, his emotions, his desperate need for connection. Previous handlers interpreted it as an attack because they couldn't conceive of that level of emotional intimacy. He drew a sigil on my palm," she whispered, showing a faint mark that shimmered beneath her skin. "It didn't burn, it sang." Webb stared. "A mark? A promise," she said. "One neither of us can break." Dr. Webb found himself caught between his scientific training and a growing sense that Sarah might be right about more than he was comfortable admitting. The creature's behavioral patterns, its apparent intelligence, its complex emotional responses, All of it suggested a level of consciousness that their protocols had never accounted for. But acknowledging that would mean confronting the ethical implications of everything they'd done, everything they were still doing. It would mean admitting that they'd been complicit in what amounted to the imprisonment and psychological torture of a sapient being. The legal ramifications alone would destroy careers and potentially land dozens of people in prison. More immediately, it would mean losing the most valuable scientific resource they'd ever encountered. The creature's secretions were already revolutionizing multiple fields of medicine and technology. The research possibilities were limitless, and the commercial applications could fund scientific advancement for decades to come. Could they really sacrifice all of that for ethical concerns about a being whose very existence challenged the foundations of human understanding? Sarah seemed to read the conflict in his expression with uncomfortable accuracy. "You're wondering if it's worth it," she said softly. "Whether one creature's freedom is worth giving up all the potential benefits of keeping him here. Whether the greater good justifies the individual sacrifice." Dr. Webb didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. "Here's what you're not considering," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a quality that reminded him unnervingly of the creature's own alien harmonics. Kalen isn't just producing biological secretions. What he creates is directly tied to his emotional state, his sense of connection and purpose. The samples I've been collecting are so much more potent than anything you harvested before, because he's finally found someone who sees him as more than a resource to be exploited. She stood up, moving to the window that looked out over the facility's stark concrete walls. "If you want to continue benefiting from his gifts, you need to start treating him like the person he is. And that means acknowledging that he has rights, needs, and desires that go beyond simply existing for your convenience." The ultimatum was delivered quietly, but its implications hit Dr. Webb like a physical blow. Sarah wasn't just advocating for the creature. She was threatening to withdraw her cooperation unless its conditions improved. Given that she was the only handler who had ever successfully bonded with Subject 47, that threat carried the weight of shutting down the entire program. But there was something else in her tone, something that suggested her loyalty had already shifted in ways that went far beyond professional advocacy. When she spoke about the creature, there was a warmth and protectiveness in her voice that Dr. Webb recognized from his own marriage, from the way his wife talked about their children. Sarah was falling in love with Subject 47, and from all indications, the feeling was mutual. The question was what they were going to do about it, and whether Dr. Webb could maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anything his protocols had prepared him for. Because if Sarah's claims about the creature's intelligence and emotional capacity were true, then they weren't just dealing with an unprecedented scientific discovery. They were witnessing the first confirmed case of interspecies romance in human history, and nobody had any idea what the consequences might be. The facility's morning briefing descended into chaos when Sarah's overnight request was leaked to the broader research team. Dr. Elizabeth Cray, the head of xenobiology, stood at the conference table with printouts scattered before her like evidence in a criminal trial. "This is how we lose everything," she announced to the assembled department heads, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "One handler gets emotionally compromised, and suddenly we're supposed to throw out 5 decades of established protocol." Dr. Webb tried to maintain control of the meeting, but the room had already fractured into competing factions. The security team wanted Sarah removed immediately, citing unprecedented risk factors that their insurance couldn't possibly cover. The research division was split between those who saw Sarah's connection as an invaluable scientific opportunity and those who viewed it as contamination of their data sets. The psychological evaluations are conclusive, Dr. Marcus Reed from the psychiatric division interjected, sliding his own reports across the table. Subject Sarah is exhibiting classic symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, complicated by what appears to be xenophilic attraction disorder. Her objectivity has been completely compromised. That's not what the data shows, Dr. Martinez countered, pulling up holographic displays of Sarah's brain scans. Her neurological patterns during interaction with subject 47 don't match any known psychological disorder. If anything, she's showing enhanced cognitive function across multiple metrics. Whatever's happening to her, it's not pathological. The debate might have continued for hours, if not for the emergency alert that suddenly flooded the room with pulsing red light. Every screen in the briefing room switched to the containment monitoring system, showing feeds from inside the sphere where Subject 47 was supposed to be resting during its inactive period. Instead, the creature was standing at the center of the chamber with its arms raised toward the ceiling, producing sounds that their audio equipment had never recorded before. Not the harmonious tones that Sarah described as music, but something deeper and more primal that seemed to resonate through the facility's steel and concrete structure. "What's it doing?" Dr. Cray demanded. But nobody had an answer. The creature's vocalizations grew stronger, and the monitoring equipment began registering energy readings that shouldn't have been possible. The containment sphere itself was starting to resonate in harmony with whatever the creature was producing, creating a feedback loop that threatened to overwhelm their instruments. "Where's Sarah?" Dr. Webb barked into his communicator. "Get her down to containment immediately." But Sarah was already running through the corridors, having felt Kaylin's distress through their connection long before the alarms started sounding. The creature's gift against her chest was burning with sympathetic energy, and she could feel his desperation like a physical weight pressing against her heart. She burst into the observation room just as the containment sphere's structural integrity warnings began flashing. The mountain trembled with the sound of something older than science, like a cathedral's bell tolling beneath the earth. Through the reinforced viewing windows, she could see Kaylin's magnificent form, wreathed in energy that made the air itself seem to sing with harmonics beyond human perception. "He's calling for me," she said simply, moving toward the airlock controls. "Sarah, stop." Dr. Webb grabbed her arm, but she shook him off with surprising strength. "The energy readings are off the charts. We don't know what's happening in there." "I know exactly what's happening," she replied, her fingers dancing over the airlock authorization sequence. "He's been patient for 50 years, but his patience has limits. You can't keep treating him like an animal and expect him to cooperate indefinitely." The containment sphere's door cycled open, and Sarah stepped inside without hesitation. The moment she crossed the threshold, Kaylin's distress call cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. The energy readings dropped to normal levels, and the facility's emergency systems gradually wound down to standby mode. Through the observation windows, the research team watched in stunned silence as the creature moved toward Sarah with obvious relief and joy. When they embraced, and there was no other word for it, the monitoring equipment registered a synchronized spike in both their biological functions that looked more like harmony than anything threatening. "This changes everything," Dr. Martinez whispered, her eyes fixed on the displays, showing perfectly matched brainwave patterns between human and creature. They're not just bonded emotionally. They're achieving some kind of neurological synchronization that shouldn't be biologically possible. In the containment sphere, Sarah was learning the full extent of Kalen's capabilities. The sounds he'd been producing weren't just emotional expression. They were a form of communication that operated on frequencies beyond human hearing, reaching out through dimensions that normal physics couldn't account for. He'd been trying to contact others of his kind, searching across impossible distances for any sign that he wasn't the last of his species. "You're not alone," Sarah told him, pressing her forehead against his in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "You have me now. We'll figure out the rest together." But Kalen's response carried undertones of urgency that made her step back in concern. Through their connection, he was showing her images that made her blood run cold. Not memories this time, but visions of potential futures. Scenes of the facility under attack, of military forces surrounding the mountain, of herself and Kalen, separated by barriers that no amount of love could overcome. "They're coming," she whispered, understanding flooding through her, like ice water. "Someone knows about what you can do, about what we've achieved together. They want to take you away." The creature's confirmation was a wave of ancient sadness mixed with protective fury. He'd sensed the approaching threat through senses that could detect danger across vast distances, had felt the malevolent attention of forces that viewed him as nothing more than a weapon to be controlled. His distress call hadn't just been loneliness. It had been a warning. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. If government forces or competing research organizations had learned about the breakthrough results from Kalen's secretions, they would stop at nothing to claim him for themselves. The facility's security was designed to keep one creature contained, not to repel a full-scale military operation. "We have to get you out of here," she said, but Kalen's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He couldn't leave, not just because of the facility's containment measures, but because his connection to this place ran deeper than simple captivity. The temple where he'd been found, the artifact he'd been guarding, the responsibility he'd carried for millennia. All of it was tied to specific geographical locations that he couldn't abandon. Through their bond, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what the military had disrupted 50 years ago. Kalen wasn't just a guardian. He was a sentinel, one of many beings charged with maintaining barriers between worlds that weren't meant to touch. The artifact he'd been protecting wasn't treasure or technology, but a seal holding back forces that would make humanity's worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. By taking him from his post, the military had weakened that seal. For 5 decades, Kalen had been trying to maintain the barrier from a distance, using his own life force to compensate for his physical absence. It was killing him slowly, and it was only a matter of time before the seal failed completely. "That's why you need me," Sarah realized, the full picture finally becoming clear. It's not just loneliness or the need for connection. You need a human partner to help maintain the seal. That's what the secretions really are. Concentrated life force that can be channeled across dimensional barriers. Kalen's agreement came with waves of desperate hope and crushing fear. Sarah was the first human who had proven capable of forming the necessary bond. But their connection was still new, still fragile. If they were separated now, before the partnership could fully stabilize, the consequences would be catastrophic for both their worlds. In the observation room, Dr. Webb was receiving reports that confirmed his worst fears. Military vehicles were approaching the facility's outer perimeter, accompanied by personnel from agencies whose existence was officially denied. Someone with clearance levels far above his own had decided that Subject 47 was too valuable to remain under civilian scientific oversight. "How long do we have?" he asked his security chief. "Maybe 6 hours before they reach the inner facility. They'll have cutting equipment that can breach any barrier we can deploy. Orders are to secure the asset and transfer it to an undisclosed location for enhanced research protocols." Dr. Webb closed his eyes, knowing that enhanced research protocols was a euphemism for experimentation that would make their current procedures look humane. They would dissect Kalen piece by piece, trying to understand the source of his abilities without caring about the consciousness that created them. And Sarah, with her unprecedented connection to the creature, would either be eliminated as a security risk or subjected to her own battery of tests to determine how her bond could be replicated or weaponized. "There is another option, Doctor," Martinez said quietly, her voice barely audible over the facility's emergency preparations. The containment sphere was designed with fail-safes that could be activated in extreme circumstances. If Subject 47 were to be declared a critical threat to global security, the sphere could be jettisoned from the facility and transported to a more secure location. "Where?" Dr. Webb demanded. "Anywhere we choose. The sphere is completely self-contained, capable of maintaining life support for extended periods. It could be hidden, moved, kept safe until we can find a permanent solution." The plan was insane, illegal, and would end all their careers if they were caught. It would also be their only chance of keeping Kalen and Sarah together, of preserving the unprecedented scientific breakthrough they'd achieved, and of preventing the creature from being turned into a weapon by forces that would never understand what they were truly dealing with. Dr. Webb looked around the room at his colleagues, seeing his own desperation reflected in their faces. They'd dedicated their lives to pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, and now they were being asked to hand over their greatest discovery to people who would use it for purposes that had nothing to do with science or understanding. "Do it," he said finally. "Activate the emergency protocols and prepare the sphere for transport. We're going off the grid." The red lights flickered like votive candles at the end of a doomed sermon. Webb didn't nod. He fell, and when he stood again, his career was already over. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that would have been impossible without the cooperation of nearly every department in the facility. The containment sphere's emergency systems were activated, sealing it off from the facility's main infrastructure and converting it into an independent life support pod. Transport vehicles were requisitioned through black budget channels that Dr. Webb had never expected to use. Most crucially, Sarah was briefed on a plan that would require her to trust people she barely knew with the life of the being she'd come to love. "You understand what this means," Dr. Webb told her during their final meeting before the transport began. "Once we move Kalen, there's no going back. You'll both be fugitives from forces that have resources we can't match. We can keep you hidden for a while, but eventually they'll find you." "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Sarah replied, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the creature's gift through her shirt. "Kalen has been a prisoner for 50 years. Whatever comes next, at least it will be his choice." The evacuation began just as the first military scouts reached the facility's outer defenses. The containment sphere detached from its mounting systems with a series of mechanical sounds that echoed through the mountain like the heartbeat of some massive creature. Sarah remained inside with Kalen throughout the process, her presence keeping him calm as their world literally shifted around them. Through the sphere's limited external cameras, she watched the familiar corridors of the facility disappear, replaced by the dark interior of a transport vehicle that Dr. Webb had somehow procured from sources. The journey he wouldn't identify that followed was a disorienting blend of smooth highway travel and rough off-road terrain as they were moved through a network of safe houses and hidden facilities that existed in the shadows between official and unofficial government operations. But the most remarkable part of the evacuation wasn't the logistics or the narrow escape from military capture. It was the transformation that occurred in Kalen himself as they traveled further from the facility that had been his prison for 50 years. With each mile that separated them from that sterile concrete structure, Sarah could feel him growing stronger, more vital, more connected to the world beyond their sphere. The creature who had spent decades as a caged specimen was remembering what it felt like to be free, even if that freedom was still constrained by the walls of their mobile prison. His joy was infectious, flooding through their bond with such intensity that Sarah found herself laughing with pure happiness, despite the uncertainty of their situation. Outside, storms formed halos over the convoy. Each flash of lightning etched them together, human and monster, against a world that no longer had rules for what they were. They were fugitives now, hunted by forces that would never stop searching for them. Their future was uncertain, dangerous, and filled with challenges that neither of them fully understood. But for the first time in 50 years, Kalen had hope, and for the first time in her life, Sarah had found someone who saw her not as she appeared to be, but as she truly was in the deepest parts of her soul. Their love story was just beginning, and already it was rewriting the rules of what was possible when two minds from different worlds chose to become one. The transport vehicle carrying their sphere came to a stop after what felt like days of travel, though Sarah's internal clock had become completely unreliable in the windowless environment. When the external cameras activated, she found herself looking at a landscape so remote and desolate that it seemed like another planet entirely. Rocky formations stretched to the horizon under a sky so vast and empty that it made her feel like she was seeing infinity for the first time. "Where are we?" she whispered, more to herself than to Kalen. But his response came as a flood of recognition and ancient memory that nearly knocked her off her feet. This place wasn't random. Dr. Webb and his team hadn't just chosen an isolated location to hide them. They'd brought them to a site that resonated with the same energies that Kalen had been guarding for millennia. Through their bond, Sarah could feel the presence of other seals, other barriers between worlds that were maintained by forces beyond human understanding. The air shimmered with unseen architecture, pillars of light humming beneath the desert. Kalen knelt, pressing his palm into the soil, and the earth answered like an old friend. Sarah joined him, her heartbeat syncing with the pulse of the world. For the first time, she understood what it meant to belong everywhere and nowhere. "You can feel them too," she said, understanding dawning as she realized why this place felt so familiar, despite being somewhere she'd never been. "There are others like you, other guardians maintaining the barriers. We're not alone." Kalen's response was complex, relief mixed with urgency, hope tempered by the knowledge that their work was far from over. The seal he'd been forced to abandon was still weakening, still requiring his attention across impossible distances. But here, in this place, where multiple barriers converged, he might be able to strengthen his connection enough to to properly maintain his responsibilities while remaining free. The sphere's airlock cycled open for the first time since their escape, and Sarah stepped out into air that tasted of sage and starlight and possibilities that had no names. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful, carved by wind and time into shapes that seemed to tell stories in languages older than human civilization. Kaylin emerged behind her, moving with fluid grace across terrain that should have been difficult for a being who had spent 50 years in captivity. But this wasn't just any landscape. It was a place of power, a convergence point where the barriers between worlds grew thin enough for beings like him to draw strength directly from the fabric of reality itself. My God, Dr. Webb's voice came through the communication system they'd installed in the sphere. The energy readings we're getting from your location are off the charts. Sarah, what you're seeing isn't just a remote hideout. It's one of the most significant paranormal sites in North America. Through their bond, Sarah was learning that paranormal was far too small a word for what surrounded them. This place was a nexus, a point where multiple realities touched each other so closely that the boundaries became permeable. It was why Kaylin felt stronger here, why the air itself seemed alive with potential energy. It was also why they needed to be extremely careful about what they did next. So there you have it, the incredible true story of Sarah and Kaylin, the most extraordinary love story ever documented between human and creature. A desperate woman who took the job nobody else would touch, only to discover that the real monster wasn't the being they'd imprisoned for 50 years, but the system that had kept him caged in the first place. Their bond didn't just revolutionize science. It rewrote the rules of what love can look like when two souls recognize each other across the vastness of different worlds. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from conquering what we fear, but from opening our hearts to what we don't understand.